China has a zero COVID policy. They're not backing down, even if it destroys the economy. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The Chinese Communist Party has staked their reputation on controlling the coronavirus. They're basically the only country in the world still sticking with a zero COVID policy. That means they're trying to stamp out the virus with quarantines and lockdowns. And their zero COVID policy is doing great, according to themselves. But others have bought into the Chinese regime's claims as well. And from the very beginning of the pandemic, in March 2020, Nature magazine ran this article about what China's coronavirus response can teach the rest of the world, which specifically mentioned countries looking at whether China's extreme lockdowns worked to contain the virus. I've talked before about how the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarian coronavirus policies influenced the rest of the world. Even medical journals like The Lancet published articles about China's successful control of COVID-19. And Western media have said China has COVID-19 well contained. Of course, all these articles rely on official Chinese statistics for how many people got or died from COVID. First of all, no one in China trusts official Chinese statistics, not even Chinese officials. But even if you believe China has pretty much contained most of its coronavirus outbreaks since the initial outbreak in Wuhan, it's clear the infection numbers in Wuhan were undercounted, even according to Chinese researchers. And deaths in Wuhan were far higher than the official count, too. And yet, so many people in the West still believe China's COVID numbers. Now, it's understandable that in the beginning of the outbreak, it would have been hard to accurately count all infections. But that's not the only reason for China's undercounting of COVID cases. The Chinese Communist Party always penalizes lower-level officials for policy failures while protecting the party leadership. That incentivizes officials at every level to cover up bad news so they don't get punished. It also incentivizes officials to take extreme measures to carry out orders from party leaders so they don't get punished. So when Chinese leaders say they want zero COVID, local officials are going to deliver zero COVID, at least according to official numbers. But even as Chinese officials double down on zero COVID, there are signs it's falling apart. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. China's zero COVID policy is facing a backlash, especially in Xi'an, a city of 13 million people. It's entering its third week of a strict lockdown. More than 42,000 people have been sent to quarantine camps, and no one in the city is allowed to leave their home. That's led to a few issues, like residents saying they don't have enough food, while officials insist there are adequate supplies. I wonder who to believe, the starving residents or the officials who will be punished if people don't have food. Other stories emerged, like hundreds of people being forced out of their apartments in the middle of the night and sent to quarantine camps, where people complained they didn't have heat or supplies. As more and more complaints were posted online, the Xi'an authorities stepped in to solve the problem by banning online comments. Communism is truly the best system. In a mass text message sent to the city, authorities announced from January 4th, people are banned from posting details of the pandemic restrictions, particularly negative news. And they also reminded everyone that they were being watched and any negative news would be automatically deleted. But you can understand why Xi'an authorities are so sensitive. After all, the more bad publicity their lockdown gets, the more likely they're going to be punished. And while most people in China seem to have supported the Communist Party's zero COVID policy, the harsh restrictions in Xi'an have led to not just local complaints, but a nationwide backlash. The turning point seems to have been after at least 2 Xi'an women in late stages of their pregnancies lost unborn babies because they were denied access to medical attention. A relative of one of the women had posted a video of her bleeding outside the hospital that refused to treat her because her negative COVID test had expired. But don't worry, that'll never happen again, because Xi'an authorities will automatically delete that negative news, just like they deleted those women's babies. Good news, though, for the people of Xi'an. All of their sacrifices were worth it, because community spread of COVID-19 has been basically blocked in Xi'an. Yeah, hold up. Basically blocked? What does basically mean? Xi'an has basically stopped the spread of COVID-19. The virus spread in communities had been basically cut off. That sounds like it's not really cut off. Chinese officials have called it achieving zero COVID on a societal level. What? According to officials, all the new cases found were among the people who were quarantined at designated places or at home. So people are still getting COVID, but only people who have already been quarantined at camps or at home. That's what they're calling zero COVID on a societal level. But wait a minute, isn't everyone in Xi'an quarantined at camps or at home? No one can spread COVID at a societal level when you've completely shut down society. Zero COVID on a societal level is not zero COVID. You've moved the goalposts so far, they're not even on the football field anymore. And speaking of moving, apparently, one way Xi'an officials are achieving societal zero COVID is by literally moving residents out of the city. Hey, technically those COVID cases are not in Xi'an anymore, just like technically there's no more negative news about Xi'an lockdowns. Communism is truly the best system. Changing zero COVID to societal zero COVID seems to be admitting that the zero COVID policy isn't working so well anymore. So why is the Chinese Communist Party sticking with zero COVID? Because they have to. I'll explain why after the break. Welcome back. Everyone knows the Chinese Communist Party is never wrong, at least according to themselves. Party leaders have staked their political legitimacy on controlling the coronavirus. And after spending so long talking about how much better they're doing than Western countries, they can't back down. This is one reason the Eurasia Group has called China's zero COVID policy one of the biggest risks to the world in 2022. They're predicting that China's zero COVID policy will fail. But there's nothing China can do about it. The initial success of zero COVID and Chinese leader Xi Jinping's personal attachment to it makes it impossible to change course. So that's the political reason the Chinese regime can't give up on zero COVID. There's a practical reason too. Chinese officials say they've vaccinated over 1.2 billion people. But Chinese COVID vaccines are less effective than Western vaccines, especially at controlling transmission. And they haven't developed as many treatments for COVID either. So if they do ease their zero COVID policy, they could be looking at skyrocketing outbreaks, especially with the new Omicron variant. China might be stuck in a cycle of more and more outbreaks, leading to more and more severe lockdowns. In fact, we may already be seeing this. Omicron has surfaced in Tianjin, a city of 14 million near Beijing. Tianjin is on partial lockdown. And Omicron has spread from Tianjin to the city of Anyang in Henan province. And Anyang is now completely locked down as well. That means 20 million people in 3 cities are under full lockdown, not even counting Tianjin's partial lockdown. There's also a separate Delta outbreak happening in Shenzhen, in southern China. And entry into Shenzhen is now being restricted. As more and more lockdowns happen, it's going to be a big problem for China's economy. And not just China's economy. Shenzhen is a major manufacturing hub. If it locks down, that will affect supply chains around the world. Even Xi'an's lockdown is hitting major microchip manufacturers. But even though continued lockdowns could destroy China's economy, the Communist Party isn't going to stop anytime soon. Next week, the traditional Chinese New Year travel rush begins. tens of millions of people usually travel home to see family. But while there aren't any nationwide restrictions on travel so far, I wouldn't be surprised if local officials tried to restrict people entering or leaving for the new year. After all, they don't want to get punished if an outbreak happens in their area. And guess what's happening at the same time as Chinese New Year? The Winter Olympics, which will be held in Beijing in less than a month. Did I mention that Tianjin is pretty close to Beijing? It's 30 minutes away by train. I have a feeling that Tianjin is going to get locked down real soon, because a massive Omicron outbreak at the Winter Olympics would be a political disaster for the Chinese Communist Party. Although on the plus side, if there is an outbreak, the Chinese Communist Party can just blame the foreigners. Communism is truly the best system. And now it's time for me to answer a question from a member of the China Uncensored 50 Cent Army, a fan who supports the show on the crowdfunding websites Patreon and Locals. To thank them, I answer a question at the end of each episode. Thomas Adney asks, how can the Olympics be COVID-free? Good question, Thomas. Chinese authorities have basically designed a giant COVID-free bubble for the Olympics. On the Chinese side, thousands of game-related staff, volunteers, cleaners, cooks, and coach drivers will be cocooned for weeks in the so-called closed loop with no direct physical access to the outside world. The authorities are so serious about keeping people in this closed loop that they've even warned Beijing residents not to help if they see an Olympic vehicle crash. There will be no spectators from outside China at the Olympics. People watching will be picked by the authorities, and no shouting or cheering will be allowed. Foreigners, including athletes, coming into the closed loop will have to be either fully vaccinated or quarantined for 21 days. And athletes will need to go through COVID tests every day and remain within the closed loop at all times. But even with all these precautions, an outbreak at the Olympics is still possible, especially an Omicron outbreak. Hong Kong has a 3-week quarantine in place for people entering the city, and Omicron still got in. Omicron is like the sneaky raccoon making its way into the Zero Covid trash can. But the closed loop does have some advantages, at least for the Chinese regime. Journalists coming to Beijing to cover the Olympics will be completely isolated from the rest of China, so no pesky trips to interview Chinese human rights activists. Thanks for your question, Thomas, and thanks for supporting us on Patreon. If you like the show and want to see us keep going and get access to a bunch of other cool perks, check out patreon.com/ChinaUncensored or ChinaUncensored.locals.com. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.